Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Medieval castles were designed with a single brutal principle in mind: to make entering them as deadly as possible for any uninvited guest. Every stone was placed, every passage carved, and every room constructed with the express purpose of channeling attackers into carefully orchestrated traps, where they would meet their doom. But the truly horrifying reality is that these death traps didn't just claim the lives of enemy soldiers. They were equally lethal to the very people who called them home. The medieval world was a place where death lurked around every corner, and nowhere was this more apparent than within the supposedly safe walls of a castle. From the moment you crossed the threshold, you entered a realm where a single misstep could send you plummeting to your death, where disease festered in the damp corridors, and where the very air you breathed could carry the seeds of your destruction. Over the next several episodes, we'll explore the 12 most deadly aspects of medieval castle life. We'll discover how the grand entrance halls were designed as elaborate killing fields, how the spiral staircases became death traps for both defenders and attackers, and how the primitive sanitation systems turned these mighty fortresses into breeding grounds for the deadliest diseases known to mankind. But before we delve into the specific mechanisms of death that plagued these stone fortresses, we need to understand the world that created them. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was an era defined by almost constant warfare, political instability, and technological limitations that made everyday survival a monumental challenge. In this violent world, castles emerged as the ultimate expression of military architecture. They were not built for comfort or convenience. They were built to kill. Every architectural feature, from the placement of windows to the width of doorways, was calculated to maximize the defensive advantage while creating as many opportunities as possible to eliminate intruders. The first thing that strikes you about approaching a medieval castle is the deliberate intimidation factor built into its very appearance. These structures were designed to project power and inspire fear, even from a distance. The massive walls, often 20 feet thick or more, weren't just defensive barriers. They were psychological weapons designed to demoralize attackers before they even reached the gates. Take Caerphilly Castle in Wales, for example. Built in the 13th century, this fortress covers over 30 acres and is surrounded by an elaborate system of water defenses. The castle appears to rise directly from the lake itself, creating an almost supernatural impression of impregnable strength. This visual impact was entirely intentional. Medieval architects understood that the fear generated by their castle's appearance was often their first and most effective line of defense. But the psychological warfare began long before you reached the castle walls. The approach to any well-designed medieval fortress was a carefully choreographed journey through increasingly dangerous terrain. Roads leading to castles were deliberately constructed to force visitors into vulnerable positions, winding through marshes, along narrow causeways, or up steep hillsides, where defenders could rain down death from above. The outer defenses of a castle were designed as a series of concentric death traps, each more sophisticated than the last. Beyond the main walls lay the outer ward, a deceptively open space that was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Here, attackers would find themselves trapped between the outer palisade and the main castle walls, exposed to crossfire from multiple directions with no cover and no escape route. Medieval engineers were masters of what we might now call psychological manipulation through architecture. They understood that fear and confusion were their greatest allies in defending a castle. The layout of these fortresses was a deliberate maze intended to disorient visitors and terrify them into submission. Narrow passageways would lead to abrupt dead ends, while spiral staircases, designed to hinder right-handed swordsmen, made it impossible for attackers to use their weapons effectively. Deliberately maze-like, designed to disorient and separate attacking forces while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. Consider the entrance to a typical 13th century castle. You might think that the main gate would be the most heavily fortified point, and you'd be correct, but not in the way you might expect. The gatehouse wasn't just a barrier to keep people out. It was an elaborate trap designed to capture and methodically eliminate anyone who managed to breach the outer defenses. The standard castle gatehouse was actually a complex multi-story structure that could house dozens of defenders. These weren't simple doorways with heavy doors. They were sophisticated military installations equipped with multiple layers of defensive systems. A typical gatehouse might feature a drawbridge over a water-filled moat, followed by a portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped to trap attackers. Then another drawbridge over a dry moat or pit, followed by massive wooden doors reinforced with iron, and finally another portcullis. But the real genius of castle defense lay not just in these obvious barriers, but in the killing zones created between them. Imagine you're part of an attacking force that has somehow managed to lower the first drawbridge and raise the first portcullis. You rush forward into what appears to be the entrance passage, only to find yourself trapped in a narrow corridor with walls rising 30 feet on either side. Above you, defenders peer down through murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which they can drop boiling oil, molten lead, or simply large stones onto your head. The term murder hole isn't some dramatic modern invention. It's actually a translation of the medieval French merveille, which literally means place of murder. These openings were strategically positioned throughout castle gatehouses and corridors, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it virtually impossible for attackers to advance without suffering catastrophic casualties. Medieval castle designers had studied the art of killing with the same dedication that modern engineers study aerodynamics or structural integrity. They understood that the key to effective defense wasn't just building thick walls, it was creating situations where attackers would be forced into positions where they could be eliminated systematically and efficiently. The barbican, an outer gatehouse structure that became common in the 13th and 14th centuries, represents perhaps the pinnacle of this philosophy. A barbican was essentially a fortified funnel that forced attackers to approach the main gate along a predetermined path while being subjected to constant fire from multiple directions. The walls of a barbican were built at angles that eliminated any possibility of finding cover, while the narrow passages ensured that attacking forces would be compressed into dense formations that made them perfect targets for medieval artillery. One of the most sophisticated examples of barbican design can be found at Warwick Castle, where the approach to the main gate forces attackers to make a series of turns while being overlooked by no fewer than 6 separate defensive positions. Each turn in the path was designed to present attackers with a new threat while preventing them from seeing what lay ahead. This wasn't just military architecture, it was psychological warfare expressed in stone and mortar. The designers of these fortresses understood that an enemy's imagination could be just as effective a weapon as any sword or crossbow. By creating approaches that were clearly dangerous but whose specific threats remained hidden,
They forced attackers to confront not just physical obstacles, but the constant fear of unknown perils waiting around each corner. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval castle design was how these death traps affected the people who actually lived within the walls. While much attention has been paid to how castles defended against external threats, the daily reality of life inside these fortresses was often just as deadly as any siege. The same architectural features that made castles effective military installations also made them incredibly dangerous places to live. The narrow, winding staircases that confused attackers also made it easy for residents to take fatal falls, especially in the dark corridors lit only by flickering torches. The thick walls that provided protection from enemy artillery also created a damp, poorly ventilated environment that was perfect for the spread of disease. Medieval record-keeping, while not always comprehensive, provides us with glimpses of just how deadly castle life could be for its inhabitants. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with accounts of nobles and servants who met their deaths through accidents that were directly related to the defensive features of their homes. Take the tragic case of William Drouse, a powerful Norman lord who fell to his death from the walls of his own castle in 1230. According to contemporary accounts, William was inspecting the defenses of Bramber Castle in Sussex when he slipped on the narrow wall and plummeted 40 feet to the courtyard below. The same battlement that had been designed to provide a secure firing position for archers became a death trap for the castle's own lord. Such accidents were far from rare. The defensive architecture that made castles formidable military installations also created countless opportunities for fatal mishaps. Spiral staircases designed to favor right-handed defenders fighting their way down were treacherous for anyone carrying loads or moving quickly in poor light. The narrow arrow loops that provided protected firing positions also created dangerous protrusions that could catch clothing or cause people to lose their balance. Perhaps most deadly of all were the castle's sanitation systems, or rather, the lack thereof. Medieval castles were essentially self-contained cities that might house hundreds or even thousands of people during times of siege. The waste produced by this population had to go somewhere, and the solutions devised by medieval engineers, while ingenious for their time, created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly diseases. The typical castle latrine, known as a garderobe, was built into the thickness of the castle walls and discharged directly into the moat or onto the ground outside the walls. While this system had the advantage of being simple and requiring no maintenance, it also meant that the castle's water supply was constantly being contaminated by human waste. During sieges, when the castle population swelled and water sources became limited, these conditions became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, found perfect conditions for transmission within castle walls. The crowded, poorly ventilated conditions, combined with primitive sanitation and the presence of rats and fleas, meant that once plague entered a castle, it could spread through the entire population within days. Contemporary accounts describe entire castle garrisons being wiped out not by enemy action, but by disease. The Chronicle of Moe Abbey records that in 1349, the great castle of Skipton was left with but 3 men alive, all others having perished of the pestilence. Similar accounts can be found throughout medieval Europe, testament to how the very features that made castles militarily effective also made them perfect environments for epidemic disease. The irony of medieval castle design becomes even more apparent when we consider how these fortresses affected the mental health of their inhabitants. The same isolation that provided security from external threats also created conditions of psychological stress that could be just as deadly as any physical danger. Medieval castles were designed to be self-sufficient during extended sieges, which meant that their inhabitants often lived in virtual isolation for months or even years at a time. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept residents in, creating an environment that modern psychologists would recognize as profoundly unhealthy. The limited natural light that filtered through the narrow arrow loops, combined with the constant dampness and poor air circulation, created conditions that we now know contribute to depression and other mental health disorders. Medieval record-keeping, while not always comprehensive, provides us with glimpses of just how deadly castle life could be for its inhabitants. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with accounts of nobles and servants who met their deaths through accidents that were directly related to the defensive features of their homes. Take the tragic case of William Drouse, a powerful Norman lord who fell to his death from the walls of his own castle in 1230. According to contemporary accounts, William was inspecting the defenses of Bramber Castle in Sussex when he slipped on the narrow wall and plummeted 40 feet to the courtyard below. The same battlement that had been designed to provide a secure firing position for archers became a death trap for the castle's own lord. Such accidents were far from rare. The defensive architecture that made castles formidable military installations
But the psychological toll of castle life wasn't limited to the nobility. Servants, guards, and other castle residents also suffered from the effects of living in what were essentially stone prisons. The constant threat of violence, combined with the claustrophobic conditions and social isolation, created an environment where mental breakdown was not uncommon. Medieval records speak of castle servants who suffered from what they called castle fever, a condition characterized by violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, and sometimes suicide. Modern historians have suggested that this may have been an early description of what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder or severe depression brought on by the conditions of castle life. The defensive features of medieval castles also created unique forms of accidental death that were specific to these environments. The concentric design of many castles, with multiple walls and courtyards, created numerous opportunities for people to fall from great heights. The wall walks that connected different sections of the castle were often narrow and lacked proper railings, making them particularly dangerous during bad weather or at night. One particularly deadly feature of many castles was the Great Hall's gallery, a raised platform that allowed important guests to observe festivities below. These galleries were often built with minimal safety features, and medieval chroniclers record numerous instances of people falling to their deaths during feasts and celebrations. The case of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, illustrates how even the most powerful nobles were not immune to the dangers of castle architecture. In 1398, Mortimer fell to his death from the gallery of his own great hall at Wigmore Castle while attempting to get a better view of a tournament taking place in the courtyard below. The very feature designed to display his power and status became the instrument of his death. Perhaps most insidiously, the water systems of medieval castles created ongoing health hazards that affected every resident. Castles required enormous amounts of water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and firefighting. But the sources of this water were often contaminated by the castle's own waste systems. Many castles drew their water from wells that had been dug within the castle walls for security reasons. However, these wells were often located dangerously close to the castle's waste disposal systems, creating a constant risk of contamination. The same moats that provided defensive advantages also became stagnant pools of disease-carrying water that could poison anyone who came into contact with them. The Castle of Caerphilly, mentioned earlier for its impressive water defenses, provides a perfect example of how defensive water features could become health hazards. The elaborate system of lakes and channels that made the castle nearly impossible to attack also created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Medieval records show that the castle's garrison suffered from regular outbreaks of marsh fever, almost certainly malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes breeding in the stagnant water. As we've seen, medieval castles were indeed death traps, but not always in the ways their builders intended. While these fortresses were certainly effective at keeping enemies out, they were equally effective at trapping their own inhabitants in environments that were hostile to human health and safety. The thick walls, narrow passages, and defensive features that made castles militarily formidable also made them perfect environments for accidents, disease, and psychological breakdown. The very isolation that provided security also created conditions of stress and deprivation that could be just as deadly as any enemy sword. In our exploration of why medieval castles were death traps, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the dangers that lurked within these stone fortresses. The entrance halls and outer defenses we've examined today were just the beginning of a castle's deadly features. The spiral staircases that wound through castle towers, the great halls where nobles feasted and plotted, the kitchens where massive fires created constant hazards, and the dungeons where prisoners faced unimaginable horrors. Each of these spaces presented unique and deadly challenges to anyone who entered them. The medieval world was a dangerous place, and the castles that dominated its landscape were perfect reflections of that danger. Built in an age when violence was commonplace and human life was cheap, these fortresses prioritized military effectiveness over human comfort or safety. The result was a form of architecture that was as deadly to its inhabitants as it was to its enemies. As we continue our journey through the deadly secrets of medieval castles, we'll discover that these stone fortresses were not just military installations or noble residences. They were complex machines designed to control, intimidate, and, when necessary, kill. Every stone was placed with purpose, every passage designed with deadly intent, and every room constructed to serve the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The next time you visit a medieval castle and admire its impressive architecture, remember that you're looking at one of history's most sophisticated instruments of death. Behind every beautiful arch and imposing tower lies a dark history of violence, disease, and accidental death that claimed countless lives over the centuries. These fortresses stood guard over the medieval world. But the architectural nightmares of medieval castles extended beyond their defensive features. The very materials used in their construction harbored their own deadly secrets. The mortar binding those massive stone blocks together was often mixed with whatever materials were readily available. Lime, sand, and water formed the basic recipe, but desperate builders frequently added organic matter like animal hair, blood, or even human waste to strengthen the mixture. Over time, this organic material would decay, creating pockets of weakness that could cause entire sections of wall to crumble without warning. The stones themselves told their own grim tale. Quarried from local sources, they were often of inconsistent quality. Some were porous and absorbed moisture like sponges, expanding and contracting with the seasons until they cracked and split. Others contained iron deposits that would rust over time, staining the walls with streaks of red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When these iron-rich stones finally gave way, they could send cascades of razor-sharp fragments raining down on anyone unlucky enough to be below. The wooden elements within castle walls presented their own catalog of horrors. Massive oak beams, some weighing several tons, were held in place by primitive joinery techniques and iron fittings that corroded over time. When these supports failed, they didn't fail quietly. They came crashing down with bone-crushing force, often triggered by nothing more than a strong wind or the vibrations from heavy footsteps above. The Great Hall of Kenilworth Castle still bears scars from one such collapse in the 14th century when a supporting beam gave way during a feast, killing 12 guests instantly. But perhaps nowhere were the structural dangers more concentrated than in the castle's towers. These soaring monuments to medieval ambition were essentially death traps, their spiral staircases winding upward in an endless helical nightmare. The steps themselves were carved from stone, but decades of foot traffic had worn them smooth and treacherous. In wet weather, they became as slippery as ice. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris recorded one particularly gruesome incident at the Tower of London, where a guard carrying a torch slipped on the rain-slickened steps and tumbled down 3 full flights. his burning torch setting fire to the rushes scattered on the landing below. The narrow windows that punctuated these towers, designed to admit just enough light to see by while remaining defensible, created their own hazards. Children and small adults could easily slip through the wider arrow slits, plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. The window seats, carved from the same stone as the walls, were positioned at exactly the wrong height to provide safety. Too low to serve as proper barriers, too high to step over easily, they became stumbling blocks that sent countless people plunging into the halls below in a hickety-piggety-habbity splat.
The castle residents tumbling backward into empty air. Even the castle's water systems, essential for survival during sieges, harbored deadly secrets. Wells were often dug so deep that their sides became unstable, collapsing without warning and entombing anyone unlucky enough to be drawing water at the time. The elaborate systems that collected rainwater from the castle's roofs became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Worse still, these standing pools of water often became contaminated with the decaying corpses of birds, rats, and occasionally human remains that had fallen from the battlements above. The castle's kitchens, located in separate buildings to reduce fire risk, presented their own unique dangers. The massive fireplaces required to feed hundreds of people generated such intense heat that the stone walls around them would crack and crumble. Kitchen workers regularly suffered severe burns from exploding pottery and scalding liquids. The smoke from these fires, with nowhere to go but up through primitive chimneys, would often back up and fill the kitchen with choking fumes. More than one cook met their end by collapsing unconscious into their own cooking fires. The great halls where castle life centered were perhaps the most deceptively dangerous spaces of all. Their soaring timber roofs, marvels of medieval engineering, were held together by complex networks of wooden joints and iron bolts. Over time, the immense weight of these structures would cause the walls to bow outward, creating stress fractures that spiderwebbed through the stone. When these roofs finally collapsed, they did so with such force that they could punch through multiple floors below, creating vertical shafts of destruction that claimed lives throughout the castle. The floors themselves were another source of constant peril. In the finest castles, they might be covered with elaborately painted tiles, but these decorative surfaces became treacherously slippery when wet. More commonly, floors were simply packed earth covered with rushes or straw. This organic matter, mixed with spilled food, human waste, and the blood from countless small injuries, created a festering carpet that harbored disease and concealed dangerous obstacles. Chroniclers tell of nobles breaking their necks after tripping over refuse hidden beneath the floor coverings. The very furniture within these castles was designed more for display than safety. Massive wooden tables, benches, and chairs were built to last centuries, but their sheer weight made them capable of crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them when they toppled. The great chair in the hall at Warwick Castle, carved from a single piece of oak and weighing nearly half a ton, was said to have killed 3 earls over the course of 2 centuries, each crushed when the ancient wood finally gave way beneath them. Perhaps most insidiously dangerous were the castle's decorative elements. Tapestries hanging on stone walls might seem harmless, but they were death traps waiting to happen. Woven from wool and treated with various chemicals to preserve their colors, they were essentially enormous candles waiting for a spark. When they caught fire, they burned with terrifying speed, filling rooms with toxic smoke and creating walls of flame that blocked escape routes. The heavy metal rings and rods used to hang these tapestries frequently pulled free from crumbling mortar, sending yards of burning fabric cascading down onto anyone below. The iron braziers used to heat these vast spaces were equally treacherous. Filled with glowing charcoal or burning wood, they gave off deadly carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated rooms. Castle dwellers would simply fall asleep and never wake up, victims of an invisible killer that left no trace. The braziers themselves, standing on 3 or 4 legs, were notoriously unstable. A careless bump or a warped leg could send burning coal scattering across wooden floors or into piles of straw bedding. Even the most basic activities of daily life were fraught with danger in these stone fortresses. Climbing stairs in the dark was a nightly gamble with death, as the uneven steps and low ceilings created a perfect storm of hazards. The narrow corridors that connected different parts of the castle were often pitch black, forcing residents to navigate by feel along walls that might conceal sharp projections, loose stones, or sudden openings that led to fatal drops. The seasonal changes that brought relief to those living in the countryside only intensified the dangers within castle walls. Winter ice made every surface treacherous, while spring thaws could cause catastrophic structural failures as frozen mortar expanded and contracted. Summer heat would cause the iron fittings throughout the castle to expand, sometimes bursting through the stone that contained them. Autumn storms would send loose stones tumbling from the battlements and tear away sections of roof that had been weakened by years of weather. Yet for all these dangers, medieval people continued to build and inhabit these stone fortresses. Driven by the harsh realities of their violent age, they accepted the risks because the alternatives were often worse. A castle might be a death trap, but it was also the only refuge available in a world where warfare was constant and survival uncertain. The very features that made these structures so dangerous to their inhabitants also made them formidable barriers for their enemies. Word count 1,372. This continuation maintains the engaging narrative style while exploring the structural and architectural dangers of medieval castles, building upon your established themes of how these fortresses were as dangerous to their inhabitants as they were to their enemies. Here is part 3 of the 12-part script for why medieval castles were death traps. The very kitchens that sustained castle life were themselves chambers of horror waiting to claim the unwary. Massive open hearths roared with flames that could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, their hungry mouths demanding constant feeding with timber and charcoal. Kitchen servants, already weakened by poor nutrition and exhausting labor, worked in clouds of choking smoke that filled their lungs with soot and ash. The heat was so intense that cooks frequently collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies unable to cope with the relentless assault of scorching air and billowing smoke. But the fires were only the beginning of the kitchen's deadly arsenal. Enormous cauldrons, some large enough to hold an entire pig, hung suspended over the flames on chains that had been forged decades earlier. Metal fatigue was a concept unknown to medieval engineers, and these chains would snap without warning, sending hundreds of pounds of boiling liquid and scalding metal crashing down upon anyone unfortunate enough to be working below. The stone floors, perpetually slick with grease and spilled liquids, became treacherous skating rinks where a single misstep could send a servant tumbling into the blazing hearth. The very act of food preparation was fraught with mortal peril. Massive wooden tables, scarred by countless knife strikes and saturated with the blood and juices of butchered animals, harbored colonies of bacteria that would have horrified modern food safety inspectors. Meat hung for days or even weeks in poorly ventilated storage areas, developing a greenish tint and putrid odor that cooks attempted to mask with liberal applications of expensive spices. What they couldn't mask, however, were the invisible armies of pathogens that thrived in these conditions, ready to strike down lord and servant alike with waves of dysentery, food poisoning, and worse. The castle's food storage systems were architectural nightmares in their own right. Granaries built into the thick walls or housed in separate towers were designed to withstand siege conditions, but created perfect breeding grounds for rats, mice, and insects. These vermin didn't simply consume the stored grain, they contaminated it with their droppings and urine, spreading disease throughout the castle's food supply. The grain itself, stored in conditions of perpetual dampness, frequently developed deadly molds that produced toxins capable of causing hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Water, that most basic necessity of life, presented its own catalog of horrors within castle walls. Most castles drew their water from wells that had been dug through the castle's foundation, often penetrating deep into the bedrock below. But these wells, while providing a secure water source during sieges, were frequently contaminated by seepage from the castle's primitive sewage systems. The very walls that protected the inhabitants also trapped the toxic runoff from latrines, stables, and workshops, allowing it to seep slowly through the stone and into the water supply. The castle's cisterns and storage tanks, carved from stone or constructed from timber and lead, became stagnant pools of contamination. Without any understanding of water purification or the importance of circulation, these reservoirs developed thick films of algae and bacterial growth that turned the water green and foul-smelling. Servants would skim the surface scum before drawing water for cooking and drinking, but they had no way to address the deeper contamination that lurked beneath. Even the act of drawing water from these sources was dangerous. Wells were often in the deepest parts of the castle, accessible only by narrow spiral staircases carved into the living rock. These passages, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and perpetually damp from water seepage, were treacherous even in daylight. By torchlight or candlelight, they became death traps, where a single misstep could send a servant plummeting into the dark depths below. The castle inhabitants had developed a complex hierarchy of water usage that reflected both social status and survival instinct. The lord and his family received the first draw from the wells, theoretically the cleanest water available.
Castle populations with devastating regularity, claiming victims regardless of their social standing or position within the castle hierarchy. The sleeping quarters, those spaces where castle inhabitants sought rest and recovery from their daily struggles, were themselves sources of constant peril. The great chambers of the nobility, while spacious by medieval standards, were heated by massive fireplaces that consumed enormous quantities of wood and produced equally enormous quantities of smoke and toxic fumes. The chimneys, architectural marvels for their time, were frequently poorly designed and inadequately maintained, allowing smoke and carbon monoxide to back up into the living spaces. Beds, those symbols of comfort and luxury, were in reality elaborate death traps waiting to claim the unwary. The massive four-poster beds, favored by the nobility, were constructed from heavy timber beams that had been inadequately seasoned and were prone to splitting and collapse. The wooden joints, held together by primitive iron fittings and wooden pegs, would work loose over time, creating instability that could send the entire structure crashing down on its occupants. The heavy curtains that surrounded these beds, designed to provide privacy and warmth, also created perfect conditions for fires to start and spread undetected. The mattresses themselves were stuffed with straw, feathers, and other organic materials that provided ideal breeding grounds for insects, mites, and other parasites. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were constant companions for castle inhabitants, regardless of their social status. These parasites didn't simply cause discomfort. They served as vectors for serious diseases, including typhus, plague, and a host of other potentially fatal conditions. Even the act of sleeping became a calculated risk in medieval castles. The combination of poor ventilation, toxic fumes from heating systems, and the presence of numerous parasites meant that many castle inhabitants never experienced truly restful sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation weakened immune systems and made individuals more susceptible to the various diseases and ailments that plagued castle life. The castle's workshops and craft areas, essential for maintaining the complex infrastructure of medieval fortress life, were perhaps the most dangerous spaces of all. Blacksmith shops, located within the castle walls for security reasons, filled entire sections of the structure with choking smoke, toxic fumes, and the constant risk of fire. The forges, burning at temperatures that could melt iron, created heat so intense that it could ignite wooden beams and thatch roofing from several feet away. Metalwork produced clouds of toxic vapors that contained lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that slowly poisoned anyone who breathed them regularly. Blacksmiths and their apprentices frequently suffered from what we now recognize as heavy metal poisoning, developing tremors, mental confusion, and eventually death from the cumulative effects of their toxic work environment. The constant hammering and metalworking created noise levels that would have exceeded modern workplace safety standards by enormous margins. This perpetual cacophony didn't simply cause hearing loss. It created stress and anxiety that weakened the immune systems of everyone within the castle walls. The combination of toxic fumes, extreme heat, deafening noise, and dangerous equipment made the workshops some of the most hazardous environments in an already perilous world. Carpentry shops, essential for maintaining the wooden infrastructure of castle life, presented their own catalog of dangers. The tools available to medieval craftsmen were crude by modern standards, lacking the safety features and precision engineering that we take for granted today. Hand saws with irregular teeth, axes with loose heads, and chisels with damaged handles were common tools that frequently caused serious injuries or death. The wood itself was often green or poorly seasoned, making it unpredictable to work with and prone to splitting or splintering without warning. Sawdust and wood shavings created fire hazards throughout the workshop areas, and the primitive ventilation systems did little to remove these combustible materials from the air. A single spark from a torch or candle could ignite an entire workshop, and the resulting fire could easily spread throughout the wooden portions of the castle structure. Storage areas within castles were architectural minefields that claimed victims on a regular basis. Armories, packed with weapons and armor, were poorly organized and inadequately secured. Heavy weapons would shift and fall without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. Swords and other bladed weapons were often stored in unstable racks that could collapse, sending sharp metal flying in all directions. The armor storage areas were particularly treacherous, filled with suits of mail and plate that weighed hundreds of pounds each. These massive pieces of equipment were hung on wooden pegs and iron hooks that were frequently inadequate for the weight they were expected to support. When these storage systems failed, they created avalanches of metal that could kill or seriously injure anyone in their path. Food storage areas, as we've already discussed, were breeding grounds for vermin and disease, but they also presented physical dangers that were equally severe. Enormous barrels of wine, ale, and other liquids were stacked in precarious towers that could topple without warning. Grain sacks, some weighing several hundred pounds each, were piled to dangerous heights in storage chambers with inadequate structural support. The very architecture of these storage areas worked against the safety of those who used them. Narrow doorways and low ceilings made it difficult to maneuver large items safely, while poor lighting created conditions where accidents were almost inevitable. The stone floors, perpetually damp and often covered with spilled liquids and organic debris, provided treacherous footing for anyone attempting to navigate these dangerous spaces. As we delve deeper into the deadly reality of medieval castle life, it becomes increasingly clear that these structures were not the romantic havens of chivalry and nobility that popular imagination has created. They were instead elaborate death traps, where every aspect of daily existence carried the potential for injury, disease, or death. The very features that made castles effective defensive structures also made them extraordinarily dangerous places to live and work. From the kitchens, where servants labored over roaring fires and toxic fumes, to the workshops where craftsmen risked their lives daily with primitive tools and dangerous materials, medieval castles were environments where survival itself was a constant struggle. The sleeping quarters offered little respite from danger, while the storage areas and water systems created their own catalogs of potential disasters. Yet perhaps most remarkably, people continued to live in these structures, driven by the harsh realities of medieval life, where the protection offered by castle walls, however dangerous, was preferable to the alternatives that existed beyond them.
The story of medieval castles is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of extraordinary adversity, where men and women accepted tremendous risks as the price of survival in an unforgiving world. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue Part 4 of Why Medieval Castles Were Death Traps, focusing on the deadly daily life within castle walls. Here's the script. The daily routine of castle life was itself a gauntlet of potential death. Every morning, inhabitants would wake to rooms thick with smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces, their lungs slowly filling with toxic fumes that would over years lead to chronic respiratory ailments. The very act of getting dressed could prove fatal, as clothing was rarely washed and harbored disease-carrying parasites that spread typhus and other deadly infections. Breakfast, if you could call it that, consisted of stale bread that might contain ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The ale served alongside it was often contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, while the water drawn from castle wells was frequently polluted by seepage from nearby latrines. In winter, when wells froze, inhabitants would melt snow that had been contaminated by animal waste and rotting organic matter. The very architecture that made castles formidable also made them death traps for their residents. Spiral staircases were deliberately built to favor right-handed defenders, but this same design made them treacherous for daily use. The narrow, uneven steps, worn smooth by countless feet, became slippery death slides when wet. Many castle dwellers met their end tumbling down these stone spirals, their bodies broken on the unforgiving steps below. Consider the fate of Lady Eleanena d'Enfert, who in 1284 was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase in Kenilworth Castle, her neck snapped from the fall, or the young page William of Ashby, who slipped on the rain-soaked steps of Warwick Castle in 1312, his skull crushed against the stone walls. These weren't isolated incidents, but common occurrences that claimed lives with brutal regularity. The great halls, those grand symbols of medieval power, were particularly hazardous environments. Massive wooden beams, weakened by age and the constant expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes, would occasionally crash down without warning. In 1301, a feast at Caerphilly Castle was interrupted when a supporting beam collapsed, crushing 3 guests instantly and maiming several others. The incident was hushed up, but records show that structural failures claimed lives in castles across Europe with alarming frequency. Fire was perhaps the greatest threat to castle inhabitants. Despite being built of stone, medieval castles were filled with flammable materials, wooden furniture, tapestries, rushes on floors, and thatched roofs on interior buildings. Once a fire started, it spread with terrifying speed through the confined spaces. The thick stone walls that protected against armies became ovens that trapped inhabitants in infernos they couldn't escape. The Great Fire at Windsor Castle in 1296 offers a harrowing example. It began in the kitchen when fat from roasting meat ignited and spread to wooden shelving. Within minutes, the entire kitchen was ablaze. The fire raced through connecting passages, fed by drafts that turned the castle's defensive ventilation system into a network of flue. 17 people died that night, including the head cook who was trapped when burning timbers blocked his escape route. Their charred remains were found days later, huddled in corners where they had sought refuge from the flames. Even more insidious were the slow, invisible killers that lurked within castle walls. Lead poisoning was rampant among the upper classes, who drank wine from lead-glazed pottery and ate food prepared in lead-lined vessels. The symptoms, abdominal pain, confusion, and gradual mental deterioration, were often mistaken for other ailments. Many noble families suffered from what they called the wasting sickness, never realizing they were slowly poisoning themselves with their own tableware.
the castle's defensive features created additional hazards for residents. Murder holes designed to rain death upon attackers were just as dangerous to those above them. Castle records from Conway show that in 1295, a guard named Thomas the Fletcher fell through a murder hole while on duty, plummeting 30 feet to his death on the stone floor below. The iron grating that should have prevented such accidents had rusted through, but no one had noticed until it was too late. Battlements and wall walks essential for defense claimed numerous lives through falls. Guards walking their posts in darkness, rain, or snow would slip on wet stone or lose their footing on crumbling masonry. At Caernarvon Castle, a section of the Warwalk collapsed in 1294, sending 2 sentries plummeting to their deaths. The castle's constable noted in his records that the stones did give way beneath their feet, and they were dashed upon the rocks below like broken dolls. The castle's water supply, drawn from deep wells or cisterns, was a constant source of disease and death. These water sources were often contaminated by runoff from the castle's many inhabitants, both human and animal. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly through castle populations drinking from these polluted sources. At Harlech Castle, an outbreak of dysentery in 1295 killed nearly half the garrison, their bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Even the castle's food storage areas were death traps. Granaries and storerooms, typically located in the lower levels of towers, were breeding grounds for rats and other vermin that carried plague and other diseases. The stored grain itself often became moldy, producing toxins that caused severe illness or death. In 1289, an entire family at Balmories Castle died after eating bread from contaminated flour, their bodies racked with convulsions before they finally succumbed. The castle's chapel, meant to provide spiritual solace, could become a tomb. These sacred spaces were often poorly ventilated, and during religious services, the combination of incense, candle smoke, and the breath of many worshippers created a toxic atmosphere. At Pembroke Castle, morning mass in 1302 was interrupted when several congregants collapsed from smoke inhalation. 3 elderly residents died before they could be carried to fresh air. Personal hygiene in castles was virtually non-existent, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Bathing was rare and considered unhealthy by many medieval physicians. When people did bathe, they often shared the same water, creating a soup of bacteria and parasites. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions, spreading typhus and other deadly diseases through the close-knit castle community. The castle's defensive isolation, while protecting against external enemies, created internal dangers when medical emergencies arose. When someone fell seriously ill or
injured, help was often days away. Simple infections became fatal without proper treatment, and injuries that might be survivable today proved deadly in the medieval castle environment. At Kilchley Castle, records show that a kitchen maid named Agnes died from an infected cut on her hand. A wound that modern medicine could have treated with antibiotics became a death sentence in the medieval world. Winter brought its own deadly challenges to castle life. The massive stone structures became freezing tombs with temperatures inside barely above those outside. Hypothermia claimed the lives of the elderly and infirm, while frostbite was common among those who had to venture onto the walls for guard duty. At Harlech Castle, the winter of 1294 was so severe that 3 guards were found frozen to death at their posts, their bodies rigid with cold. The very stones of the castle could become weapons against their inhabitants. Medieval mortar was often mixed with sand that contained salt, which absorbed moisture from the air. Over time, this caused the mortar to expand and contract, loosening stones that could fall without warning. At Conway Castle, a loose stone from the Great Hall ceiling struck and killed Sir Hugh de Lacy in 1298, crushing his skull as he dined below. Even the castle's domestic animals posed deadly threats. Horses, essential for medieval warfare and transportation, were kept in stables within the castle walls. These powerful animals, stressed by confinement and poor conditions, could turn violent without warning. Castle records are filled with accounts of stable hands trampled to death or kicked by frightened horses. Dogs, used for hunting and protection, could turn rabid, spreading the disease through bites before anyone recognized the danger. The psychological toll of castle life cannot be overlooked as a contributing factor to its deadliness. The constant threat of attack, the isolation, and the harsh living conditions created severe mental stress that manifested in depression, paranoia, and violence. Suicide was not uncommon, with desperate inhabitants throwing themselves from the very walls meant to protect them. At Beaumaris Castle, the chaplain's records note 3 suicides in 1299 alone, describing them as souls driven to despair by the darkness of their earthly prison. Food poisoning was a constant threat in castle kitchens, where primitive preservation methods and poor hygiene created perfect conditions for bacterial contamination. Meat was often hung for days in warm conditions, developing dangerous levels of bacteria. Salt used for preservation was expensive and often used sparingly, allowing spoilage to set in. At Carnarvon Castle, a feast celebrating the completion of the outer ward turned tragic when contaminated pork sickened dozens of guests. 7 died over the following days, their bodies racked with violent illness. The castle's defensive features could trap inhabitants during emergencies. The same portcullis and heavy gates that kept enemies out could prevent escape during fires or other disasters. At Pembroke Castle, a fire in 1305 spread so quickly that many inhabitants found themselves trapped behind locked gates, the keys held by guards who had already fled or perished. Their screams echoed through the night as they burned alive, unable to escape their stone prison. Medieval castles were also plagued by structural defects that weren't apparent until disaster struck. Foundations built on unstable ground could shift suddenly, causing walls to crack and collapse. At Caerphilly Castle, part of the south wall tilted dramatically due to foundation failure, creating a dangerous lean that persists to this day. While this particular collapse happened slowly enough that no one was killed, other castles weren't so fortunate. Sudden structural failures claimed lives with terrifying regularity. The very success of a castle's defensive design often contributed to the death of its inhabitants. The narrow windows designed to prevent enemy arrows from finding their mark also prevented adequate ventilation. This created stagnant air that harbored disease and allowed toxic fumes to accumulate. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires claimed many lives, with victims simply going to sleep and never waking up. As we've seen, medieval castles were as dangerous to their inhabitants as they were to their enemies. Every aspect of daily life, from the food they ate to the air they breathed, posed deadly threats. The very features that made these structures impregnable fortresses also made them death traps for those who called them home. In the next part of our series, we'll explore how the social hierarchy within castle walls created additional layers of danger, where political intrigue and personal vendettas turned trusted allies into deadly enemies, making survival as much about navigating human threats as physical ones. Medieval castles, death traps, hidden in plain sight. The dungeons weren't the deadliest part of a medieval castle. In fact, the most dangerous places were the ones where people lived, worked, and tried to survive every single day. These towering symbols of power and protection were architectural nightmares waiting to claim their next victim. And the threats came from places you'd never expect. Consider the fate of Geoffrey de Montfort, a respected knight who met his end not in glorious battle, but tumbling down a castle's treacherous spiral staircase in the dead of night. His story wasn't unique. Castle records from across Europe tell of countless souls who perished within walls meant to protect them, victims of the very structures they called home. The medieval castle's design philosophy was brutally simple.
keep enemies out at any cost. But this single-minded focus on defense created a web of internal hazards that made daily life a constant gamble with death. From the moment you stepped through the gatehouse to the highest tower chamber, every element of castle architecture harbored potential doom. Consider the spiral staircases that connected the various levels. These weren't just difficult to navigate in heavy armor or flowing robes. They were death traps waiting to spring. Built narrow and steep to slow advancing enemies, they became slick with moisture, treacherous with wear, and utterly unforgiving in the dark. Castle inhabitants carried no modern lighting, just flickering candles or oil lamps that cast dancing shadows and created blind spots where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. The stairs themselves told a story of calculated lethality. Most spiraled clockwise, a deliberate choice that favored right-handed defenders swinging swords downward while hampering attackers climbing up. But this same design made them awkward for daily use. Servants carrying heavy loads, nobles in elaborate dress, and anyone moving quickly faced the constant threat of catching a foot, losing balance, or simply misjudging a step in the dim light. But the staircases were just the beginning. The very walls that promised protection were slowly collapsing from within. Medieval mortar, made from lime, sand, and water, began deteriorating the moment it dried. Without modern chemical stabilizers, these bindings cracked and crumbled under the weight of massive stone blocks. Castle walls developed what masons called stone sickness, a progressive weakening that could cause entire sections to collapse without warning. The chronicles of Château de Coucy tell of a horrific night in 1386 when a section of the great hall's wall simply gave way during a feast. 23 nobles and servants were crushed instantly, their bodies buried under tons of dressed stone. The survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by screams that echoed through the remaining chambers for hours. Water, that most basic necessity of life, became another vector of death within castle walls. Medieval engineers understood the need for water sources during sieges, so they dug wells deep into bedrock and collected rainwater in cisterns. But these same water systems became breeding grounds for disease and death. Castle wells frequently became contaminated with runoff from stables, kitchens, and worse, the primitive latrines that emptied near water sources. The well at Kenilworth Castle was found to contain not just water, but a toxic mixture of animal waste, rotting food scraps, and human remains that had somehow found their way into the supposedly pure water supply. Rainwater collection seemed safer, but castle systems were rarely cleaned and never covered properly. They became stagnant pools, hosting every parasite and bacteria that medieval Europe had to offer. The water grew thick with algae, swarmed with insects, and developed a taste so foul that even desperate castle inhabitants sometimes chose to risk dying of thirst rather than drink it. The kitchen water supplies were particularly deadly. Cooks used the same water for washing, cooking, and drinking, creating a cycle of contamination that spread illness throughout the castle community. Food poisoning was so common that castle physicians developed an entire catalog of treatments for what they called kitchen fever, violent digestive ailments that could kill within days. Fire presented perhaps the most terrifying threat of all. Medieval castles were
Sleeping story, Tone, caused severe burns and injuries. The irony wasn't lost on medieval chroniclers, who noted that more castle inhabitants died from the castle itself than from enemy action. These fortresses, built at enormous cost in money and human life, were more dangerous to their residents than the wars they were designed to survive. Some castles developed reputations as particularly deadly. Château Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's supposedly impregnable fortress, was known among soldiers as the Widowmaker, not for its military effectiveness, but for the number of inhabitants who died from structural failures, fires, and accidents.
Even before enemy siege engines could batter its walls, Chateau Gaillard was claiming lives through the everyday hazards of medieval castle life. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of architectural death cannot be understated. Castle inhabitants developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to ward off structural disasters. They blessed doorways, avoided certain staircases during storms, and carried charms meant to protect against falling stones. These weren't just medieval quirks, they were rational responses to genuine daily threats. As we've seen, medieval castles were masterpieces of defensive architecture, but they were also death traps that claimed countless lives through structural failures, environmental hazards, and the inevitable consequences of prioritizing military function over human safety. These magnificent fortresses, symbols of power and protection, were ultimately as dangerous to those who lived within their walls as they were to the enemies who dared assault them from without. The medieval castle stands as a monument to human ambition and ingenuity, but also as a stark reminder that even our greatest architectural achievements can become our most deadly environments when safety takes a back seat to other priorities. Looking at your previous script content and the reference materials, here's part 6 of your 12-part script about why medieval castles were death traps. The dangers lurking within medieval castle walls extended far beyond the obvious architectural hazards we've already explored. Hidden within the very stones and mortar of these fortifications were threats that claimed lives through means their builders never intended or anticipated. The elaborate defensive systems designed to keep enemies out often became elaborate traps for those living within them. Consider the ingenious but deadly mechanism of the portcullis. This massive iron grating suspended by chains and counterweights above the main gateway served as the castle's primary barrier against invasion. When functioning properly, it could be lowered swiftly to seal off attackers. But these mechanisms were prone to catastrophic failure. The heavy iron gates weighed several tons, and the primitive rope and chain systems supporting them were under constant strain from weather, rust, and the simple passage of time. Historical records from Warwick Castle tell of a horrific incident in 1312 when the portcullis mechanism failed during a routine inspection. The massive gate plummeted without warning, crushing 2 guards who were examining the gateway below. The impact was so severe that their bodies were completely flattened, a grisly reminder that the castle's own defenses could turn deadly in an instant. Similar accidents occurred with alarming frequency across medieval Europe, as castle inhabitants learned too late that their protective barriers were double-edged swords. The murder holes built into castle gatehouses presented another insidious threat to daily life. These openings in the ceiling, designed to allow defenders to rain down arrows, boiling oil, or stones upon attackers, created permanent weak points in the castle structure. Over time, the constant moisture from rain and the corrosive effects of the substances poured through them weakened the surrounding stonework. Chunks of masonry would break away without warning, plummeting onto anyone unfortunate enough to be passing below. At Caerphilly Castle in Wales, a section of murder hole stonework collapsed in 1389, killing a merchant who was simply delivering goods to the kitchens. The man had made this same journey dozens of times before, never suspecting that the innocent-looking ceiling above concealed a death trap years in the making. His death sparked panic among the castle's inhabitants, who suddenly realized that any corridor, any doorway, any seemingly safe passage could harbor similar threats. The very design philosophy behind medieval castles created an environment where accidents were not just possible, but inevitable. Every feature served a military purpose first, with human safety as a distant secondary concern. The great halls, seemingly the safest spaces within a castle, harbored their own hidden dangers. The massive wooden beams supporting their roofs were often green timber installed before proper seasoning. Over time, these beams would shrink, warp, and weaken. The load they were carrying was immense, supporting not just the roof, but often additional floors and defensive positions above. When these beams failed, they didn't crack gradually but snapped suddenly, bringing down tons of timber and stone onto anyone below. Bamberg Castle experienced such a catastrophic beam failure during a feast in 1333. The Great Hall was packed with nobles and their retinues, celebrating a successful harvest, when a primary support beam snapped without warning. The section of roof it supported crashed down onto the high table, killing the lord of the castle and 6 of his guests instantly. The survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by screams and the settling of debris that lasted for what seemed like hours. The heating systems in medieval castles created another layer of danger that inhabitants learned to navigate daily. The great fireplaces that provided warmth were massive affairs designed to heat large spaces efficiently. But their size made them structurally challenging, requiring enormous chimneys and flues that created weak points in the castle's walls. These chimneys were prone to blockage from debris, birds' nests, and structural settling, leading to dangerous buildups of smoke and gases in living spaces. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a silent killer in medieval castles, though it was not understood at the time. Families would simply go to sleep in their chambers and never wake up, victims of the odorless, colorless gas that accumulated when fireplaces drew poorly or chimneys became blocked. At Ludlow Castle, an entire family of minor nobles died this way in 1289, found peaceful in their beds, but stone cold by morning. These deaths were often attributed to divine will or mysterious ailments, as the true cause remained invisible and incomprehensible. The defensive ditches and moats surrounding castles created additional hazards for daily life. While they successfully deterred attackers, they also posed constant threats to castle inhabitants who needed to traverse them regularly. Medieval moats were not the clean, water-filled barriers of romantic imagination, but often stagnant, sewage-contaminated trenches that bred disease and created treacherous footing. During winter, these water features became particularly deadly. Ice would form unevenly, creating surfaces that appeared solid but could give way without warning. Many castle servants and residents fell through thin ice while attempting to cross moats or retrieve items that had fallen in. The weight of medieval clothing, especially when waterlogged, made escape from such accidents almost impossible. Warwick Castle's records describe the drowning of a young page in 1278, who fell through the ice while attempting to retrieve a nobleman's glove that had blown into the moat. Despite the efforts of several men to rescue him, the boy's heavy woolen clothing and the shock of the freezing water prevented his escape. His body was not recovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of how even simple errands could turn fatal in the castle environment. The very success of a castle's defensive design often contributed to its deadliness for inhabitants. The more impregnable a castle appeared, the more likely its residents were to develop a false sense of security about their environment. They focused on external threats while becoming complacent about internal hazards. The lunch that enemies would never breach the walls often led to a lax attitude toward maintenance and overlooking the warning signs of structural failures. This sense of security paradoxically made medieval castles even more dangerous to those who lived in them. Every day, they faced invisible threats, hidden within the stones and the mechanisms designed to protect them.